Hey guys, tonight we begin with the truly baffling realm of medieval romance, where dating advice involved astrology, pork fat, and occasionally a duel. If you thought modern dating was complicated, imagine trying to impress someone when your main flirting tool was a lute and a prayer. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In modern romance, we're told eye contact builds connection. In medieval Europe, it built suspicion, engagement contracts, or lawsuits, depending on how long you held it. Courtship in the Middle Ages often started with a look, not a glance, but a carefully timed, morally calibrated look. Too brief, and you seemed uninterested. Too long, and you were essentially proposing marriage or challenging her father to a duel. Romantic, but risky. Manuals of courtly love advised that men gaze softly yet sincerely, a phrase that sounds like something from a 14th century perfume ad. The ideal stare was somewhere between, "I deeply admire your embroidery skills," and "I am not planning to invade your estate." One widely circulated guide warned men to avoid lingering stares of the sort that cause blushing. This was awkward, because blushing could also be caused by wind, wine, or having the plague. Still, if the lady turned pink, the man was expected to immediately look away, cross himself, and possibly flee the region. The church wasn't thrilled about any of this. They believed excessive gazing opened the soul to temptation, and probably gout. Priests preached that true affection should come from pious admiration, not eye flirtation. Couples were encouraged to keep their gaze low and their conversations brief. And if someone accidentally locked eyes in church, that was a full-blown scandal. They might as well have shared a tent. For noble women, eye contact was a battlefield. A woman of status was trained to maintain the courtly look, expressionless, distant, and vaguely bored. A wandering glance could imply flirtation, witchcraft, or indigestion, all equally dangerous. And yet, despite all this, people still locked eyes across banquet halls and muddy market squares. Lovers wrote poems about stolen glances that lasted half a heartbeat. Troubadours sang ballads about eyes that pierced the soul, which is poetic for looked at me for slightly longer than social norms allowed. In the Middle Ages, there was no such thing as deodorant, unless you count raw panic, rosemary, or a good stiff breeze. But that didn't stop people from trying to smell appealing. In fact, some dating advice straight up insisted that your romantic success hinged on whether or not you reeked of thyme. Herbs were the medieval answer to both hygiene and seduction. If you wanted to impress a potential partner, you didn't reach for cologne, you reached for your garden, or your apothecary, or if desperate, your soup pot. A common piece of advice for men was to tuck sprigs of rosemary, sage, or lavender into their sleeves or boots. This way, every time they walked past a lady, they'd leave behind a trail of floral mystery. Did it mask the scent of sweat, leather, and sheep? Not really, but it showed effort, and that was half the battle. If you were wealthier, you could carry a pomander, a fancy little ball filled with herbs, spices, and sometimes dried oranges. It hung from a chain on your belt, swayed dramatically while you walked, and gave off the strong message, "I bathe, eventually." Women too carried scented sachets or tucked herbs into their corsets, both for the smell and to repel fleas. Romance, after all, is much easier without lice. Some guides even recommended rubbing herbs directly on your skin, basil for boldness, mint for freshness, and marjoram for charm. One 13th century love text actually claimed that thyme rubbed on the chest makes the heart visible. This is either symbolic or horrifying. Either way, someone tried it. Of course, not all smells were created equal. Garlic, while common, was a mixed signal. It showed vitality, yes, but also made you smell like someone who lived in a turnip? And if your breath carried the scent of beer and pickled fish? That wasn't a romantic failure. It was just Tuesday. In the medieval world, poetry wasn't just for artistic souls. It was practically a love language, especially for the socially awkward noble who had more access to ink than charm. But here's the twist. The most acceptable way to express affection wasn't by praising your beloved's beauty or personality. No, that was too worldly. Instead, you were advised to compare her to divine figures. Ideally, the Virgin Mary. Because nothing says, "I want to court you modestly," like, "You remind me of the Holy Mother of God." Courtly love poems were often deeply religious, partly to appease the church, and partly because people didn't want to get excommunicated for being horny in rhyme. So, your average medieval suitor might pen a verse like, "O lady, purest of light, thy gaze more sacred than sacred rite." Which sounds sweet until you realise he's comparing her to a baptismal font. This trend created a whole genre of romantic confusion. One minute you're reading a love letter, the next you're unsure if it's meant for you or a monastery. One particularly famous poem referred to the beloved as "my angel of chaste delight," which is definitely the kind of thing that gets you left on red, even in the 12th century. To complicate things, many nobles hired troubadours to write love poems on their behalf. These bards specialised in verses that walked the fine line between romantic and legally deniable. The result? Songs that praised your hair, your soul, and your moral character, but made sure not to imply any sinful thoughts. Medieval sexting was, essentially, 27 stanzas of "I admire your virtue" from afar. Some women wrote back, often with poetry of their own, though theirs tended to be slightly more honest. "I admire your courage, your manners, and the fact that you have land," which, honestly, is still solid criteria. All in all, medieval poetry was a safe way to say "I like you" without actually saying "I like you." Wrap it in Latin, rhyme it with grace, and maybe quote a psalm for good measure. That way, if things went wrong, you could just claim it was meant for a nun. Let's say you've written your beloved a heartfelt message, full of poetic restraint, religious metaphors, and a tactful lack of emotional vulnerability. Well done. But you're not finished yet. Now, you need to season it. Yes, in medieval times, a proper love letter wasn't just about the words, it was about the aroma. Scented parchment was considered the height of sophistication and romantic flair. And while modern lovers might spritz perfume, your average 14th century romantic reached for the spice rack. Cinnamon, cloves, rose petals, even a dusting of ground nutmeg if you were really trying to impress someone with delicate sinuses. These were the fragrances of love, or at least the best attempt at masking the scent of ink, damp parchment, and medieval hands. According to courtly custom, these spices weren't just decorative. They were thought to convey meaning. Cinnamon represented passion. Cloves meant devotion. Saffron was expensive, so it meant, "I have money. Please notice me." Of course, by the time the letter reached its recipient, after travelling in a sweaty satchel for 3 days through rain and goat traffic, it mostly just smelled like parchment stew. Some particularly ambitious lovers folded flower petals into the letter. Dried violets, marjoram, even crushed rosemary. One ill-fated suitor included fennel, which was quickly interpreted as an insult unless the lady was a salad. In wealthier courts, entire scrolls were infused with rosewater or musk, not for subtlety, but to ensure the scent smacked the recipient directly in the nostrils. Subtlety was not the goal. Overwhelming floral assault? Much better. The trend even extended to wax seals. These could be flavoured, scented, with oils and pressed with ornate family crests. Nothing said, "My affections are sincere," like a seal that reeked of frankincense and parental expectations. Of course, some took things too far. There are accounts of letters so heavily spiced, they were mistaken for medicinal recipes or cursed scrolls. One famously fragrant poem allegedly attracted mice during delivery. Romance was complicated. Modern dating might involve flowers, chocolates, or the occasional playlist. In medieval Europe, the gesture of love was often a recently deceased woodland creature. To demonstrate bravery, masculinity, and excellent aim, knights and noblemen frequently gifted their beloveds the spoils of the hunt. A bouquet of roses was nice, but a freshly slain boar's head, still slightly steaming. That was the real way to say, "I think about you when I throw spears." This was not considered strange. In fact, it was encouraged. According to 14th century chivalric tradition, a man's hunting ability reflected his worthiness as a suitor. If you could chase down a stag, wrestle it to the ground, and present its antlers on a silver platter, you were basically a medieval Ryan Gosling, and women were expected to act delighted. A lady receiving a skinned rabbit or a basket of doves would respond with polite enthusiasm, or at least a well-practiced gasp of admiration, even if she was internally wondering where to store her third hair of the week. Some of these animal tokens were symbolic. A swan, for instance, represented purity and grace, assuming it hadn't bitten anyone during capture. Falcons, associated with nobility and power, were a common high-status gift, although they required constant feeding, training, and occasionally bit your fingers off. Romantic. Less noble men sometimes resorted to smaller prey, hedgehogs, ferrets, or the ever-popular rabbit. One lovesick baker reportedly gifted a duck to a miller's daughter, only for it to escape into her family's well. That relationship did not prosper, but the absolute apex of medieval wooing, the ceremonial deer presentation. In this lavish ritual, a knight would present a full roasted deer at a banquet in a woman's honour, often accompanied by music, flattery, and about 50 other people pretending this wasn't incredibly awkward. Of course, this all assumed the woman liked meat. If she didn't, or if she had a weak stomach, the gift of bloodied fur might backfire. Badly. Still, in a world without dating apps or casual coffee shops, a dead animal wrapped in ribbon said one thing very clearly. I braved the forest, I risked infection, and I thought of you the entire time. In medieval courtship, open flattery was a minefield. Telling a woman she was beautiful, too forward. Commenting on her lips, scandalous. Mentioning her hair, risky. It was probably hidden under 3 veils, a wimple, and divine protection. So what was safe to praise? Her shoes. Yes, in a world where flirtation could lead to excommunication, telling someone they had well-formed footwear was basically the medieval version of shooting your shot, quietly, from across the room, while also looking at the floor. Shoes were not just practical, they were a fashion statement. Pointed shoes, called poulaines, were wildly popular. Some were so long they had to be tied to the wearer's knees to avoid tripping. If a lady could walk gracefully in them without falling into a moat, that was genuinely impressive. And very eligible. Complimenting her shoes allowed a man to appear respectful, observant, and not immediately interested in sin. In fact, there's recorded advice from a 13th century etiquette book suggesting, when first you greet a lady, comment upon her garment or her step, but let not your eyes wander above the ankle, lest you bring shame. Translation: play it safe, flatter her hemline. It also worked in reverse. Women might mention a man's boots, especially if they were made of expensive leather, imported from Florence, or didn't smell like dead badger. That last one was rare. Of course, this praise was just a coded gesture. Complimenting a lady's shoes often meant, "I've noticed you. I think you're elegant. Please interpret this subtle signal before my father arranges my marriage to someone I've never met." And if she responded with a smile, a nod, or, heaven forbid, a compliment in return, that was basically a proposal. One recorded exchange went, "Your shoes are finely made, and your cloak is well stitched." 2 months later, married. 5 goats and a vineyard sealed the deal. So yes, in the tangled social rituals of medieval love, Sometimes the safest, sweetest, and weirdest way to say, "I like you," was to say, "Your shoes appear extremely competent." In the modern world, we say timing is everything. In medieval times, timing was everything. Astrology, the divine order, and possibly the reason you remained single. According to several medieval love manuals, yes, those existed. The ideal moment to confess your feelings wasn't when the moment feels right, but rather when the moon is in the proper phase and Mercury isn't sulking. A waxing moon, that's the part where it's getting bigger, was seen as a time of growth, luck, and bold declarations. So if you were planning to whisper your undying love to the blacksmith's daughter, best do it then, ideally while bathed in silver moonlight and holding something poetic, like a rose or a moderately injured bird. On the other hand, a waning moon, shrinking, was terrible for romance. Anything started during a waning moon was believed to diminish with time, including relationships, friendships, and poorly timed soup. If you confessed during a waning moon and got rejected, well, astrologers would nod solemnly and say, "Yes, obviously." Some went even deeper. Avoid the full moon if you're overly emotional, and steer clear of eclipses, unless you want your proposal followed by crop failure or public embarrassment. One 14th century monk, who probably hadn't dated in decades, warned that confessing love under a new moon would invite misfortune, tooth rot, and spiritual confusion. So, naturally, someone tried it anyway. He was later bitten by a goose. Coincidence? Medieval minds said no. This belief wasn't limited to peasants. Nobles consulted court astrologers before sending love letters, arranging betrothals, or even flirting across a banquet table. There are recorded cases of lords delaying marriages for more favourable planetary alignments, which is the 1300s equivalent of ghosting via star chart. Of course, some saw the moon as a convenient excuse. "I do like you, Beatrix, but Saturn is currently in retrograde, and my heart must obey the cosmos." Still, in a world of uncertain hygiene, political alliances, and wild boar attacks, maybe checking the sky before saying, "I love you," wasn't so strange. Love, in medieval times, wasn't always left up to fate. Sometimes it was left up to concoctions made by herbalists, witches, or your grandmother's slightly odd friend who kept dried frogs in her pantry. Enter the love potion, the medieval answer to awkward flirting, romantic rejection, and the eternal question, what if I could just make them like me, with soup? These brews were rarely subtle. One popular recipe called for honey, basil, and powdered deer heart, because nothing says romance like organ dust. Other variations included ingredients like rose petals, cinnamon, wine, and occasionally something alarming like ashes of burned hair. You had to be really in love to stir that into a drink. Some potions were meant to be ingested, others were dabbed onto clothing, a few were buried under thresholds or hidden inside baked goods, which is fine, until your crush bites into what tastes like rosemary and regret. It gets weirder. There are recipes involving graveyard dirt, boiled fingernails, and even the fat of a black cat. No actual cats, please. Medieval people had some wild ideas. One 12th century charm recommended whispering a chant over a piece of bread at sunrise, then feeding it to your beloved without telling them, which, to be clear, is how you get cursed today. Oddly enough, these love potions weren't just folk magic. They were taken quite seriously. Courts sometimes prosecuted potion makers for bewitching nobility. One nobleman claimed he was seduced against his will because the woman wore enchanted rosemary. Sure, Harold. Blame the herbs. Of course, not every potion worked. Many just made people sick, dizzy, or mysteriously prone to writing poetry. Still, belief was powerful. If someone thought they were under the spell of love, they sometimes acted the part, which frankly isn't so different from modern dating after 2 glasses of wine. In the Middle Ages, love wasn't just a matter of the heart. It was a matter of honour, bruised egos, and the occasional dented helmet. If another man so much as glanced at your beloved for half a second longer than necessary, medieval etiquette, dictated one of two responses. Write a passive-aggressive poem. Challenge him to a duel. Most chose option 2, faster results, more blood. Chivalry, that noble code of knightly conduct, heavily emphasized defending a lady's honour. Even if said lady didn't ask for it, even if she was completely unaware anything had happened, even if she had, in fact, looked at the other man first, no matter. You'd draw your sword, toss down a glove, yes, that actually happened, and announce something like, "Sir, you have insulted my lady's virtue with thine eyes. Prepare thy spleen." Duels could range from full-on jousts with horses and lances to slightly less dramatic affairs involving swords, axes, or very angry staring contests. The point wasn't necessarily to kill. It was to show you were willing to try. Nothing says I care deeply about you like risking tetanus. Sometimes these contests were official, with rules, referees, and cheering audiences. Other times they were impromptu, and ended in the village fountain with at least one person yelling, "I regret nothing." For the ladies, this was both flattering and exhausting. You could barely walk through a marketplace without sparking a minor scuffle over your ankle ribbon. Some women tried to diffuse tension by claiming poor eyesight. Oh no, I was looking at the cabbage cart, not that squire's jawline. To be fair, not all duels were over love. Some were political, some were over land, and a few were because someone mispronounced another man's name. But when romance was involved, the stakes somehow felt higher. Especially when the prize was a mildly impressed noblewoman and a vague chance at her hand in marriage. So if your crush was giving other men the look, the medieval solution was simple. Challenge, clash, bleed slightly, win affection. In medieval times, love and war weren't just metaphors. They were a matching set. And if you really wanted to show devotion to your lady, you didn't write a poem or buy a pastry. You strapped on 40 pounds of armour and pinned her favourite ribbon to your chest. This practice was called wearing her colours, and it was surprisingly common. Knights would fasten a lady's token, a handkerchief, a veil, a piece of lace, somewhere visible before heading off to war or a jousting tournament. The symbolism was simple. I fight for her honour. Also, I look great in lilac. It wasn't just romantic, it was strategic. Sporting a noblewoman's colours could boost a knight's standing, earn him patronage, and possibly improve his odds of receiving baked goods upon return. But there was a catch. You had to look dignified, even if your token was, for example, embroidered with daisies and smelled like her laundry. Some knights went full theatrical. There are records of men wearing entire sleeves from their lady's gown on their armour, dangling awkwardly and occasionally catching on weapons. One poor soul had a garter tied around his helmet, which was impressive until it slipped down mid-joust and caused a minor concussion. Colour choice mattered too. Red stood for passion. Blue meant loyalty. Green was complicated. Depending on the region, green either meant hope, fertility, or that your love interest was possibly seeing other knights. Risky business. Of course, critics of the custom claimed it made warriors look more like walking laundry racks than soldiers, but these critics often failed to attract dates. Coincidence? Likely not. Some ladies took things further and embroidered messages or blessings into the cloth. Subtle notes of encouragement like, "Victory to my champion," or "Try not to bleed out again." Practical and heartfelt. To outsiders, it all may have seemed absurd. Hardened warriors going into combat with lace ribbons fluttering beside their swords. But to the knights, it was a badge of pride, and a highly visible way of saying, "I care about someone, and I'm not afraid to get mildly impaled about it." In the medieval world, if you fancied someone, you didn't send a text or slide into their parchment scrolls. No, you stood outside their window at night and sang loudly, hoping they were awake, and that their father wasn't a light sleeper. Serenading was considered one of the noblest, most romantic gestures a suitor could perform, second only to not dying in battle. A well-executed ballad could melt hearts, win favour, and possibly earn you an awkward smile the next time she passed you at church. The key word here is well executed. Most medieval suitors were not professional musicians. They had lutes. Yes, those awkward pear-shaped instruments that always looked like they were tuned by accident, but little idea how to use them. And medieval music didn't exactly have a pop chorus. It was more chant-based. So what did these poor souls sing? Love poems about lilies, stars, and eternal devotion. Sometimes in Latin, to sound impressive. Sometimes in French, to sound expensive. Occasionally in a regional dialect that sounded like they were choking on bread. One documented case involves a baker's son in Rouen who attempted a moonlit serenade with a borrowed mandolin. His voice cracked on the second verse. His instrument broke on the third. Ladies, for their part, were meant to listen quietly, maybe peek through the shutters, and definitely not laugh out loud, even if the performance sounded like a dying goat in distress. Politeness dictated they drop a token of encouragement, a ribbon, a flower, or in some cases, a polite cough. And yes, sometimes it worked. A half-decent melody at midnight could win hearts. Other times, it won you a bucket of chamber pot water dumped from above, a traditional form of romantic feedback. Still, to the medieval mind, there was something heroic about singing your feelings into the night, even if your only audience was a startled owl and a very unimpressed cat. In an age without dating apps, moisturizers, or even basic dental plans, medieval singles turned to nature. And by nature, we mean their spice rack. Yes, one bizarre but popular piece of dating advice was this: rub herbs on your face. The logic? Smell good, look glowy, get married. Medieval love guides and herbals were surprisingly confident about this. Basil was said to rouse affection. Marjoram would soften the heart of a stubborn maiden. Rosemary, good for memory and flirtation. If you smelled like an herb garden, surely someone would want to marry you, or at least follow you around politely. Men were advised to crush herbs into a paste and smear it along their jawlines. Women often infused theirs into water and dabbed it across the cheeks and temples like some kind of 14th century toner. The results? Mixed. Very mixed. Imagine showing up to a feast with parsley oil running down your neck and thyme leaves stuck in your eyebrow. Charming, in theory. Alarming, in practice. Some guides got specific. A man should bathe his visage in mint at sunrise, that he may appear pleasing unto all who look upon him. Which is noble sounding, until you realise they probably meant literally bathing in mint, and that's assuming you had access to both mint and water, a luxury combination. The wealthy used herbal blends with rose water, saffron and sandalwood, less for seduction, more to smell like someone who didn't wrestle pigs for a living. The poor made do with garlic, onion, or whatever didn't attract rats. Romantic. Of course, rubbing basil on your cheeks didn't guarantee success, but it showed effort, and in a society where bathing was semi-annual, smelling like anything other than disappointment was already a good start. Interestingly, this practice led to entire industries. Apothecaries sold love salves made from secret recipes, red, mashed-up garden clippings, promising to make the user irresistible. Results may have varied. Side effects included sneezing and goat attraction. In a world where saying "I love you" outright could lead to scandal, a duel, or a very tense dinner with your father's overlord, medieval romantics turned to something safer and far more cryptic: flowers. Welcome to the botanical secret code of medieval courtship, where a single bloom could carry more emotional weight than an entire scroll of poetry, and also fewer spelling errors. The logic was simple. Each flower had a meaning. Red roses symbolized love, violets meant modesty, lilies represented purity, and lavender screamed, "I'd like to woo you, but let's not get excommunicated about it." Bouquets were composed like puzzles, a coded message wrapped in petals and social anxiety. Want to express desire but maintain plausible deniability? Send a mix of columbine, foolishness, and carnations, fascination. Want to apologize for accidentally flirting with her sister? Toss in some white hyacinth. Sorry, I made a mess. Want to break things off gently? There's a flower for that too, yellow carnation. Rejection, but fancy. This wasn't just idle, courtly fun. Entire medieval manuscripts detailed the meanings of herbs and flowers, turning gardens into emotional minefields. Walk through the courtyard with a daisy in your belt? You're announcing innocence? Drop a thistle on someone's doorstep? That's basically, I'd rather marry a goat. Ladies, of course, responded in kind. A returned flower meant interest. A flower thrown into a ditch meant hard no. One infamous noblewoman reportedly replied to a bouquet with a dead weed and a note. I prefer monks. That one stung. And if you were truly unlucky, your floral gesture might be eaten by the family goat before it reached its target. Romance in medieval times was nothing if not unpredictable. Even public events embraced this flowery drama. During tournaments, knights sometimes wore bouquets given by ladies, not just for aesthetics, but as statements of allegiance, or at least someone's attempt to look gallant while swinging a mace. Dancing in the Middle Ages wasn't just a pastime. It was a delicate game of romantic chess, played with your feet, your dignity, and a firm understanding of where not to place your hands. In courtly circles, dance was one of the rare socially acceptable ways to engage with the opposite sex, provided you didn't smile too widely, sweat too obviously, or, heaven forbid, make physical contact beyond fingertips. Most dances weren't exactly what we think of as dancing today. Forget twirling and dips. Medieval court dances looked more like slow-motion walking rehearsals with bonus curtsies. The Bass dance, literally low dance, involved gliding slowly in coordinated lines, gazing politely, and silently screaming inside because you just brushed elbows. Still, it was thrilling. Touching fingertips during a partnered step was practically a marriage proposal. One extra spin, and suddenly your aunt was sewing your wedding tunic. Dancing was full of coded messages. A long gaze during a turn could say, I admire you. A missed step might say, I am unworthy of your affection. And stomping on her foot meant, well, probably that you'd never speak again. For the more outgoing, village dances offered slightly looser rules. The carol, a round dance accompanied by singing, was more relaxed, but still watched closely by chaperones with hawk-like instincts and absolutely no chill. Music came from live minstrels, bagpipes, or someone hitting a drum that may or may not have been a repurposed cooking pot. Dancers had to move in sync or risk public humiliation, mild injury, or stepping on a noblewoman's gown, a punishable offence in at least 3 provinces. Interestingly, some love guides actually suggested observing your partner's dancing style as a clue to their personality. Graceful and coordinated, a good match. Wild and unpredictable, passionate, flailing like a wounded goose. Perhaps not ready for commitment. You've written the poems, sung beneath her window, worn her colours, and managed not to get gored in a joust. Congratulations. You're almost there. There's just one final boss battle in medieval romance: her family. Winning a woman's heart in the Middle Ages was only half the war. The other half involved convincing her parents, especially her father, that you were sufficiently wealthy, marginally sane, not currently excommunicated. The process was rarely romantic. It involved dowries, land discussions, and a series of tense dinners where everyone pretended they weren't negotiating a small feudal alliance. Families wanted proof of stability. Do you have sheep? Do you have land? Do you have at least one working tooth? These were the medieval equivalents of, are you emotionally available? The answer, often, was still no. Sometimes the woman's family demanded symbolic gifts, not just to show affection but to prove investment. A decent suitor might offer a bag of grain, a cloak or a carved spoon. A wealthy one might bring horses, gold, or an entire pig. If you really wanted to impress, you brought multiple pigs and possibly a monk to explain your intentions. In towns and villages, things could be more informal. but not by much. A father might judge your worthiness by your handshake, your boots, or your ability to wrestle a neighbour over property lines. It wasn't a system built on nuance. Mothers were no easier. Some insisted on testing your character with riddles, church attendance, or your ability to sit through long meals without blinking. One record describes a mother who only approved suitors who could churn butter, efficient and selective. And even if the family liked you, there were still alliances to consider. Marriages weren't just unions of affection. They were mergers of assets. You weren't just asking for her hand. You were asking for partial control of her family's goat pasture, and they knew it. Still, if you passed their tests, if you proved brave, respectful, and moderately solvent, they might nod in approval. Just once. Maybe. And that nod, that was your green light. To a Viking, death was not the end of the road. It was simply the start of a far greater journey. Life on Earth, with all its battle cries, feast halls, and long voyages, was just a proving ground. What lay beyond was what truly mattered. And for the Norse, there were multiple destinations in the afterlife, depending on how you lived, and more importantly, how you died. If you died a warrior's death, blade in hand and courage in your heart, you had a chance to be chosen by the Valkyries. These mythical female beings, Odin's fierce servants, scoured battlefields and selected the bravest of the slain. Their reward? A place in Valhalla, Odin's own mead hall in Asgard. There, the dead warriors would train for Ragnarok, the final apocalyptic battle. By day, they fought one another in glorious combat. By night, they drank and feasted as if it were their last day on earth. Then, they did it all over again. But not all souls found themselves in Valhalla. Freya, the goddess of love and war, also claimed half of the battle slain to dwell in her hall, Folkvanga. Others might journey to Helheim, a shadowy realm ruled by the goddess Hel, especially if they died of sickness, old age, or were deemed unworthy of warrior glory. Helheim wasn't necessarily a place of torment like the Christian hell, but it wasn't exactly a party either. This afterlife hierarchy mattered deeply, and so did how you were buried. A warrior who aspired to reach Valhalla couldn't just be tossed in a ditch with a few bones and regrets. The Viking people believed that the right kind of funeral could help ensure a soul's passage to the appropriate realm. They put enormous thought into burials, ensuring the deceased were honoured, remembered, and, above all, equipped. Whether it was cremation on a flaming ship or burial in a mound surrounded by weapons, food, and treasures, the dead were treated with deep respect and often even fear. If the funeral rites weren't done properly, there was always the risk of a restless spirit returning, something no one wanted to deal with. Because in the Viking world, death wasn't final, but an improperly handled death, that could haunt the living. When we think of Viking funerals, we imagine a longship set ablaze, sailing into the sunset. And while Hollywood exaggerates plenty, that fiery image isn't entirely fantasy. It's rooted in real Norse tradition. To the Vikings, a ship wasn't just a vehicle for conquering lands or raiding monasteries. It was a sacred vessel for crossing realms. In death, as in life, a ship symbolized passage. And so, when a person of high status died, a chieftain, warrior, or noblewoman, they were sometimes buried with their ship, or in it, or on it. The exact ritual varied depending on region, period, and local resources, but the symbolism remained consistent. Send the soul off in style. In coastal regions, especially around Norway and Sweden, it was common to dig a large trench in the shape of a ship, lay a real vessel in it, and place the body inside along with grave goods, swords, shields, food, animals, and even sacrificed thralls or slaves. Yes, in some cases, those closest to the deceased, especially slaves, were believed to accompany them into the afterlife, willingly or not. After the body was prepared, the ship was often covered with stones and soil, forming what we now call a burial mound. Some of the most famous Viking graves, like the Oseberg and Gokstad ships, were found perfectly preserved beneath these mounds. These sites weren't just burials, they were monuments. But what about the fire? The dramatic boat on flames drifting into the sea was likely reserved for specific coastal or island communities. In these cases, the body and grave goods were placed aboard a smaller boat, pushed into the water, and set ablaze with tar, oil, or pitch. The fire served both symbolic and practical purposes. It purified the soul, warded off evil spirits, and destroyed the vessel, preventing its reuse. A one-way ticket to the afterlife. That said, not every Viking could afford such a theatrical send-off. Ships were expensive. Only the elite, kings, jarls, wealthy traders, could be honoured in such fashion. Most common folk were buried in simpler ways, often in shallow graves with modest offerings. Still, the ship remained the most iconic symbol of Norse death rites. Whether buried beneath earth or consumed by flame, it was the vehicle that carried a Viking from Midgard to eternity. Because even in death, the sea called. While ship burials might steal the cinematic spotlight, cremation was arguably the most widespread Viking funeral practice, especially during the earlier periods of the Viking Age. And trust the Norse to turn a simple fire into a dramatic, cosmic event. For the Vikings, burning the body wasn't just a way to dispose of it. It was a sacred transformation. Fire was seen as a purifier and a messenger. As flames consumed flesh and bone, they believed the smoke carried the spirit skyward, to Odin, to Freya, or to wherever their soul was destined to roam. Cremation typically took place atop a large wooden pyre, built with care and intention. The body of the deceased would be laid in the centre, dressed in their finest clothes, and surrounded by possessions that mattered most. Weaponry for warriors, jewellery for noblewomen, perhaps tools, food, or even a favourite pet. These grave goods weren't just sentimental. They were believed to serve the deceased in the afterlife. In some cases, a funeral feast or ritual would precede the burning. Family and friends would gather, often for several days, to mourn, sing, and share stories of the deceased. Skalds, the Viking poets, might recite verses in their honour. Ritual animal sacrifices weren't unheard of either. Horses and dogs, animals of great symbolic value, were sometimes killed and added to the pyre to serve as companions in the afterlife. And yes, the fire was huge. It had to be. Burning a body to ash takes an immense amount of heat and wood. The pyre would rage, smoke billowing into the sky, drawing the attention of gods and mortals alike. To many, it was a powerful, sacred sight, the visible gateway between the living and the dead. Once the fire burned out, the remains, ashes, bone fragments, scorched weapons, were gathered with care. They might be placed in an urn and buried, or scattered across a sacred site. Sometimes the ashes were even buried beneath rune stones or in special mounds, marking the site for future generations to remember. For the Norse, cremation wasn't grim or sterile. It was a release, a roaring, glorious exit, a statement to the world. This soul mattered, and now it rides the smoke to the gods. You wouldn't go on a Viking raid without a sword, so why would you enter the afterlife empty-handed? Viking funeral rites placed immense importance on grave goods, objects buried or burned with the deceased to aid them in the next world. These weren't just sentimental tokens. They were tools, provisions, and symbols meant to equip the dead for whatever trials lay beyond death. For warriors, this meant weapons, often their best sword or axe, a sturdy shield, and sometimes even a full suit of armour. But these weren't always practical war tools. Some swords were deliberately bent or broken before burial, a symbolic gesture to kill the weapon so it could accompany the soul. It also served a clever second purpose, discouraging grave robbers. Wealthier Vikings were buried with gold and silver, coins, drinking horns, and even imported luxury items like silk or Frankish jewellery. Women might be interred with intricate brooches, keys, symbols of household authority, looms or other items related to domestic life. Children were often buried with toys or small animals. But let's not forget the larger accessories. Horses, dogs, falcons, even entire boats might be included. And in particularly high-status burials, human sacrifices were not unheard of. Slaves or servants, often drugged or ritually killed, were believed to accompany their masters into the afterlife to serve them there too. It's a grim reminder that in Viking society, status clung to you even in death. Yet not all grave goods were purely functional. Some were symbolic. A broken comb might represent cleanliness, a fishing hook survival, a hammer for Thor's protection. The choices were deliberate, spiritual, and often very personal. Interestingly, these customs varied by region. In Sweden, for example, elaborate boat graves with rich goods were more common, while in Iceland, burial was often simpler due to scarce resources. Some Norse settlements blended local traditions, like mixing pagan grave goods with early Christian symbols as conversion crept in. Grave goods weren't just about the dead. They told the living a story of who someone was, what they valued, how they died, and how they were remembered. To a Viking, a well-packed grave wasn't a morbid ritual. It was a final rite of respect, a statement of worth, and maybe even a passport to Valhalla. A Viking funeral wasn't a quick goodbye. It was an event, a grand, often multi-day affair steeped in ceremony, symbolism, and the kind of theatrical flair that only Norse culture could pull off. After all, if your death was supposed to be the start of an epic journey, your send-off needed to match. The ceremonies began with preparation. The body of the deceased would be washed and dressed in their finest clothing, sometimes with a mask or makeup applied to preserve their appearance. This task typically fell to women in the community, who were seen as spiritual caretakers of life and death alike. These women might be professional mourners or priestesses, known as vulvas, who wielded ritual authority. Then came the gathering. Family, friends, warriors, and sometimes entire villages would come together to honour the dead. In wealthier funerals, guests might travel long distances to attend. These were deeply communal moments, equal parts mourning and celebration. Think of it as a solemn wake with a touch of competitive drinking. One of the most powerful figures in the ritual was the sacrificer, a priest or chieftain who conducted the rites. This could include blood offerings, sometimes animal, sometimes human. Horses and dogs were commonly sacrificed to accompany the deceased into the next life. In rare elite cases, slaves were given intoxicants, strangled or stabbed, and laid beside their master as a final act of loyalty or domination. Music and poetry were essential. Skalds would chant the deeds of the dead, recounting their exploits in battle, their travels, and their generosity. These verses didn't just entertain, they elevated the deceased, solidifying their legacy among the living, and perhaps even the gods. Then came the climax, the burial itself. Whether cremation, ship burial, or mound interment, the ceremony reached its emotional peak here. As flames rose or soil fell, mourners might shout farewells, offer final toasts, or place last-minute items into the grave, coins, amulets, or tokens of affection. And after the burial, the funeral feast. Meat, mead, and merriment weren't just indulgent, they were spiritual. Sharing a meal honoured the dead and reaffirmed bonds among the living. Life continued, but memory remained. These rituals did more than bury the body. They helped process grief, legitimize heirs, and preserve the social order. A Viking funeral was less about death and more about legacy. If there's one detail about Viking funerals that tends to raise eyebrows, and sometimes stomachs, it's this. Human sacrifice was real, and while it wasn't part of every funeral, when it did happen, it made a lasting impression, both historically and spiritually. In Norse cosmology, the afterlife was a continuation of the life you led in Midgard. So, if a powerful chieftain or warlord had servants, guards, or concubines while living, it made sense, at least to the Vikings, that he'd want them in the next world as well. Only, of course, those companions had to get there the hard way. The most detailed account of such a rite comes from Ibn Fadlan, a 10th century Arab diplomat who witnessed a Viking funeral on the Volga River. He described in grim detail the ritual killing of a female slave, called the Angel of Death in his account, who volunteered, or was chosen, to join her master in the afterlife. The process was neither quick nor merciful. After days of preparation, intoxication, ritual sex, and ceremonial parading, she was strangled and stabbed before being laid beside the deceased in a burning ship. Disturbing, absolutely. But to the Vikings, it was a sacred duty, perhaps even an honour. Dying to serve your master in the afterlife was seen, at least by some, as a form of loyalty and spiritual elevation. But let's be clear, it was also a brutally patriarchal practice rooted in power dynamics and control. Not all sacrifices were human. Animals, especially horses, dogs, and sometimes oxen, were far more commonly killed to accompany the dead. These creatures symbolized strength, status, and companionship. Their presence in the grave served both spiritual and social purposes. Over time, especially as Christianity spread through the Norse world, the practice of human sacrifice faded. Christian clerics were horrified by these rites, and local kings, eager to align with European powers, began outlawing them. By the 11th century, most Viking territories had abandoned the practice. Still, these sacrifices remain one of the most haunting aspects of Viking funerals, a reminder that Norse culture, for all its poetry and heroism, also embraced some very dark rituals in the name of legacy and honour. In death, the Viking elite didn't just take their treasures, they took people, whether willing or not. If Viking funerals were designed to impress both gods and mortals, then the burial mound was the ultimate mic drop. These towering earthen tombs dotted the Norse landscape like scars of memory. Silent, hulking reminders that someone important had died and demanded to be remembered. The practice of building burial mounds, or hauga, dates back to pre-Viking times, but the Norse turned it into an art form. These weren't casual graves. They were architectural statements, spiritual lighthouses and territorial markers rolled into one. The size and complexity of a mound often reflected the wealth and influence of the deceased. If your mound could be seen from the fjord, from a passing road, or from the enemy settlement across the river, that meant you mattered. The process started with selecting the site. Location was everything. A burial mound near the sea might signal a chieftain with naval power. One built atop a hill could dominate a valley, staking posthumous claim to the land. In some cases, older burial mounds were even reused by later generations, establishing a sense of ancestral continuity and spiritual lineage. Inside the mound, the body was usually placed in a wooden chamber, stone-lined pit, or ship, alongside all the grave goods fit for the afterlife. The chamber might be layered with textiles, armour, or wooden furniture. Once sealed, the mound was constructed by piling earth, sand, and stones in a carefully shaped dome. Some were modest, others massive, spanning over 100 feet in diameter. Many mounds were ringed with standing stones, arranged in ship-like formations. Others were topped with wooden poles or carved staves, possibly to ward off grave robbers or to guide the spirits skyward. But mounds weren't just funerary, they were political. A chieftain's mound wasn't merely a grave, it was a statement of dominance, even in death. Local communities would continue to gather at these sites for rituals, oaths, and seasonal festivals. The dead, it seemed, never really left. They became part of the land's spiritual geography. Even today, burial mounds across Scandinavia remain sacred sites, some untouched, others excavated to reveal rich treasures and haunting echoes of Norse life. These grassy hills aren't just dirt and bones. They're monuments to legacy, built by a people who knew that being remembered was the only real path to immortality. While much of Viking history is told through the blood-slicked axes of men, their funerals tell a more complex tale, especially when it comes to the role of women. Viking women weren't just passive mourners at the edge of the grave. In many funerals they were central, mourned, revered, and even feared. One of the most remarkable discoveries in Viking archaeology is the Oseberg ship burial, not of a male warrior, but of two high-status women. Buried in a lavish wooden ship alongside silks, carvings, food, and a full wagon, the women were laid to rest in regal splendour. Their identities remain a mystery, but scholars believe one may have been a Volva, a Norse priestess, seer, or spiritual leader. In Norse culture, the Volva held immense ritual power. She spoke with the gods, saw the threads of fate, and guided the living through both life and death. Women like the Volva were often responsible for preparing the dead. They would wash and dress the corpse, perform incantations, and conduct purification rituals. Their presence in funeral rites gave them a rare but potent spiritual authority, one that even Viking warriors respected. And then there were the shield maidens, legendary women who fought alongside men and sometimes earned the same fiery farewells. While historical evidence for shield maidens remains debated, some graves, like the Birka warrior burial in Sweden, contain female remains buried with full military honours, weapons, and riding gear. These women were treated in death just like their male warrior counterparts, suggesting that martial valour transcended gender, at least occasionally. But not all funerary roles were heroic. Female slaves or concubines were sometimes sacrificed during the funerals of powerful men, as Ibn Fadlan's account chillingly reveals. These women were offered, or forced, into death to serve their masters in the afterlife, a grim reminder of the brutal hierarchies in Norse society. Still, Viking funeral rites hint at a society that could be both patriarchal and surprisingly fluid. Women could be mourners, officiants, victims, or venerated dead themselves. Their graves, rich with symbolism and status, remind us that Norse culture was not just about conquest and combat. It was about honour, power, and passage, for both men and women alike. For centuries, Viking funerals burned bright, both literally and symbolically. But by the late 10th and early 11th centuries, the flames began to dim. Not because the Norse lost their appetite for death rituals, but because a new power was reshaping the very idea of the afterlife: Christianity. As Christianity spread through Scandinavia, it brought with it a radically different concept of death. Instead of Valhalla, Helheim, or Folkvanger, there was now heaven and hell, sin and salvation. Fire was no longer sacred. It was a punishment. Cremation, once believed to free the soul, was now seen as heretical. Christian doctrine demanded burial of the intact body, facing east, awaiting resurrection. The conversion of Viking kings, like Harald Bluetooth of Denmark and Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, accelerated the shift. These rulers weren't just concerned with spirituality. Christianity offered political advantages, alliances with powerful European kingdoms, the literacy of monks, and a useful excuse to outlaw old tribal customs and centralize power. And so, Viking funeral traditions began to fade. Cremation was outlawed. Human and animal sacrifices were condemned. Volvas were silenced or absorbed into Christian sainthood stories. Pagan burial mounds were abandoned, looted, or built over with churches. In many cases, Norse people began blending the two belief systems, burying loved ones with both Christian crosses and pagan grave goods, just to be safe. Interestingly, this period of transition wasn't swift or uniform. In remote areas like Iceland, the old ways clung stubbornly to life. Some people quietly continued ship burials or mound making well into the 12th century, sometimes under the radar of church authorities. Others adapted, turning funeral feasts into Christian commemorations, or reinterpreting old symbols like Thor's hammer as harmless folk charms. But by the end of the Viking Age, the old rites had largely disappeared. No more burning ships, no more sacrificial smoke rising to Odin. Instead, wooden crosses, stone churches, and the quiet earth marked the final rest of Norse men and women. Still, echoes of the past endure. In modern Scandinavia, ancient mounds still rise from the landscape. Names like Valhalla and Odin still resonate, and every time a longship blazes across a movie screen, we're reminded of a people who faced death not with fear, but with fire, steel, and songs carried by the wind. The origins of Venetian masks begin not with theatre or pageantry, but with power, privacy, and the desire to be someone, anyone, else. By the 13th century, the Republic of Venice had become a global crossroads of wealth, trade, and culture. With riches flowing in from the east and a society built on hierarchy and surveillance, Venetians began craving something rare, the chance to escape themselves. That's where the mask came in. The earliest legal reference to mask wearing in Venice appears in 1268, when lawmakers tried to ban masked gambling. Yes, even then, anonymity had its temptations. But the mask's real rise came with Carnival, a raucous season of festivities leading up to Lent. In those weeks before 40 days of piety and restraint, Venice turned upside down. Social classes blurred, sins were temporarily forgiven, and everyone, from nobles to paupers, took to the streets in disguise. Masks weren't just costumes, they were weapons. They allowed the rigid, rule-bound citizens of Venice to momentarily cast off the expectations of gender, class, and family name. A servant could taunt his master. A noblewoman could sneak into a gambling den. A priest could walk unrecognized into a brothel. The mask equalized and destabilized. The most common mask in these early days was the bauta, a white mask with no mouth opening, worn with a black cloak and tricorn hat. It was deliberately eerie, emotionless, and utterly blank. Unlike the ornate designs of later centuries, the bauta was designed for function over flair. It allowed the wearer to speak, eat, and move undetected. In fact, during certain political assemblies, wearing a bauta was mandatory to ensure anonymity during votes. Venice took secrecy seriously. At the same time, the mask was a mirror. It reflected the contradictions of Venetian society. Wealthy but secretive, devout yet decadent, hierarchical but obsessed with appearances. The city had long been ruled by the Council of Ten, a shadowy government body known for its spy networks and secret trials. In a place like that, hiding one's face became both a defence and a game. By the late medieval period, masks weren't just tolerated, they were essential. They gave Venetians the freedom to play, flirt, rebel, and confess. And in a city built on illusion and artifice, what better symbol than a face that wasn't really yours? If the streets of Venice seemed enchanted during Carnival, it wasn't just the masks, it was the entire city surrendering to illusion. For weeks before Lent, Venice became a stage, and every citizen a performer. The rules of everyday life, the rigid hierarchy, the tight-laced etiquette, the ever-watching eye of the church, collapsed under a wave of music, laughter, and carefully orchestrated chaos. The Carnival of Venice, or Carnevale di Venezia, is first officially documented in 1296, when the Venetian Senate declared it a public holiday. But it likely had older, more pagan roots, possibly linked to Roman Saturnalia festivals, a time when roles were reversed and order was gleefully subverted. By the Renaissance, it had become the most famous festival in Europe, drawing aristocrats, travellers, and opportunists from across the continent. Masked balls took place in lavish palazzi, streets filled with jugglers, fire-breathers, and impromptu theatricals. The Grand Canal teemed with gondolas strung with lanterns and musicians. The air smelled of roasted nuts, perfume, and intrigue. But underneath the sparkle, Carnival wasn't just fun and games. It was an emotional release valve. For a city so obsessed with decorum and surveillance, Carnival allowed Venetians to indulge in what they were otherwise denied. Affairs bloomed, satire flourished, Grievances were aired in songs, gestures, or pranks, all under the protective shield of anonymity. Even the clergy, who often condemned the excesses, were known to participate, just in slightly less conspicuous attire. The ruling elite tolerated this spectacle for a reason. Carnival wasn't a rebellion, it was a carefully managed illusion of freedom. Let the people blow off steam now, and they'll stay obedient later. It was social control by way of seduction, and the mask was its crown jewel. Interestingly, laws attempted to regulate the chaos. There were strict limits on when masks could be worn, usually from December 26th to Shrove Tuesday. Even during Carnival, masks were forbidden in churches, convents, and gambling houses during daylight. But these laws were often ignored or selectively enforced. Venice, after all, thrived on bending rules with elegance. For Venetians, Carnival wasn't about becoming someone else. It was about revealing who they really were, free from consequence. And with a mask on your face and music in the air, anything, absolutely anything, seemed possible. Among the many masks of Venice, one stands above the rest in both mystery and dominance, the Bauta. Its stark white surface, sharp jawline, and blank expression gave it an unsettling neutrality. But this wasn't just a costume choice. The Bauta was both a symbol of freedom and a tool of political manipulation. Unlike other Venetian masks, the Bauta was designed for practicality. Its unique shape jutted out away from the mouth, allowing the wearer to speak, eat, and drink without removing it. Worn with a black silk cloak, tabarro, and a three-cornered hat, it created a uniform appearance that was almost militaristic. But what made it particularly fascinating was that it wasn't just worn during Carnival. It was often required by law. In political assemblies and public votes, especially those involving the Council of Ten or state matters, the Bauta was used to preserve anonymity. Every man, regardless of rank, wore the same disguise. It was democracy by disguise, at least on the surface. The idea was to remove bias, fear, or favour. No one could know who was speaking or voting, thus protecting the integrity of Venetian governance. But of course, in practice, anonymity could also be weaponized. Behind the Bauta, nobles could move unseen through the city, whispering secrets, seducing lovers, or making underhanded deals. The mask gave its wearer plausible deniability. It blurred the line between duty and decadence. This duality made the Bauta dangerous. It could empower a citizen to speak out, or a conspirator to plot. And for the general population, encountering a figure in Bauta was unsettling. Was this a nobleman, a spy, a thief, a jilted lover? You'd never know, until it was too late. Unlike more theatrical masks, the Bauta had no emotion. No smile, no frown, no flourishes. It was the anti-mask, faceless, formless, yet deeply loaded with meaning. And this, paradoxically, made it the most powerful mask of all. In time, the Bauta became emblematic of Venice itself, elegant, mysterious, and quietly menacing. Even today, it remains the most iconic of the Venetian masks, a relic of a time when identity could be erased and reinvented with nothing more than a blank white face and a tilt of a tricorn hat. If the Bauta was the mask of power, the Moretta was the mask of control, subtle, feminine, and bound in silence. Worn almost exclusively by women, the Moretta was an oval-shaped black velvet mask that covered the entire face, enhancing the pallor of the skin and drawing attention to the eyes and hair. But it came with a twist. It had no straps. Instead, it stayed in place by means of a small button held between the teeth. Yes, between the teeth. If the wearer opened her mouth, the mask would fall off, which meant the Moretta rendered a woman completely mute. And that's where the strange power of the Moretta came in. In a society that both feared and fetishized female speech, this mask turned the wearer into a figure of intrigue and mystery. A silent woman in black velvet, unable to speak, react, or explain herself, was an object of pure allure. It allowed women, especially upper-class women, to move through public spaces in a kind of social force field, hidden, elegant, untouchable. But this silence wasn't just seductive, it was strategic. Women attending mass, visiting convents, or attending secret assignations used the Moretta to protect their identities. Courtesans used it to maintain anonymity when mingling with powerful clients. In an era where a single scandal could ruin a woman's life, the Moretta offered protection, or, in some cases, plausible deniability. The mask also symbolized the tension between female agency and societal control. On one hand, it allowed women to move freely through male-dominated spaces. On the other, it literally silenced them. It gave them a kind of independence while reinforcing their objectification. Notably, the Moretta was considered especially fashionable in the 17th and 18th centuries, before falling out of use. By the time Venice began its decline and the carnival waned under Austrian and French rule, the Moretta became a relic of another time, one of many strange, beautiful, and quietly troubling customs to vanish with the end of the Republic. Today, the Moretta rarely appears in modern carnival celebrations. Its silence is no longer fashionable. But in its time, it was the mask that said everything, by saying absolutely nothing. While some Venetian masks were tools of anonymity or political ritual, others emerged from the lively world of theatre. Specifically, the bawdy improvisational performances of Commedia dell'arte. These travelling troupes of actors brought stock characters to life with wit, satire, and physical comedy, and each role came with its own distinctive mask. Over time, these theatrical masks didn't just stay on stage. They seeped into the streets of Venice and into Carnival itself. Commedia dell'arte was wildly popular from the 16th century onward. Its cast of characters were instantly recognizable. Harlequin, Arlecchino, the nimble servant with a patchwork outfit and a sly grin. Pantalone, the greedy old merchant with a hooked nose and furrowed brow. Il Dottore, the pompous and long-winded doctor who never actually healed anyone. And Colombina, the clever maid who needed no mask at all. Her expressive face was her weapon. These characters represented types, roles everyone in Venetian society could relate to or ridicule. They exaggerated real human traits: lust, greed, ignorance, cunning. And because Commedia was rooted in improvisation, the actors tailored their jokes and plots to the local gossip, politics, and scandals of the moment. It was satire, slapstick, and social commentary all wrapped into one. During Carnival, these personas spilled off the stage and into the public sphere. People dressed as Harlequin or Pantalone, not just to play a part, but to mock, to flirt, or to vent frustrations about real figures of power. By donning a Commedia mask, a Venetian could make fun of a pompous official, imitate a cheating lover, or embody the fool everyone secretly pitied. And because these characters were universal, they were disarming. They let people laugh at themselves, safely. Even the authorities, who might frown upon open rebellion, allowed the masks to do the talking. After all, who could arrest Harlequin? This fusion of theatre and reality blurred the line between performance and participation. The entire city became a stage, and every masked face a character. It was art, yes, but also defiance, fantasy, and liberation. Through these theatrical masks, Venetians found a way to express truths too dangerous to say aloud. And isn't that what Carnival was really about? Wearing a lie that told the truth. For a society obsessed with appearances, Venice walked a razor's edge between piety and pleasure, and nowhere was that tension more visible than in the church's complex relationship with masks. On one hand, the Carnival was a time of wild indulgence, with masks allowing Venetians to drink, gamble, flirt, and transgress social boundaries. On the other, Venice was a deeply Catholic republic, proudly aligned with the Pope, filled with churches, monasteries, and religious festivals. So, how did the church deal with a city full of sinners in disguise? With extreme caution and frequent contradiction. At first, Carnival was tolerated, even supported, as a useful distraction. Let the people wear their masks and indulge before Lent, the logic went. After all, everyone would be fasting, confessing and repenting soon enough. Better to blow off steam before 40 days of guilt and fish stew. But by the 16th and 17th centuries, concerns were growing. The anonymity of the mask allowed for unchecked vice. It wasn't just innocent revelry. Behind those blank faces were affairs, bribery, theft, and heresy. The confessional booths filled with tales of masked debauchery. And the clergy began to panic. The church responded with sermons, edicts, and occasional bans. Certain types of masks were forbidden in holy places. Wearing a mask in a convent or inside a church became a punishable offence. Priests warned their flocks that masked behaviour in this life could lead to divine punishment in the next. And yet, enforcement was spotty at best. Even bishops were known to host masked balls. High-ranking officials turned a blind eye when it suited them. Venetian society had always been good at looking the other way, especially when gold and politics were involved. There were moments of crackdown. During plagues, for instance, authorities banned masks outright, fearing they spread disease or encouraged dangerous gatherings. But like the carnival itself, these bans never lasted. The mask always returned. By the 18th century, as Enlightenment ideas crept in and the Republic weakened, the Church's influence started to wane. Venetian carnival, though still tied to religious rhythms, became more secular, more decadent, and less apologetic. In the end, the Church could lecture, condemn, and restrict, but it could never fully unmask Venice. The city's soul, it seemed, was always half in shadow, half in grace. For centuries, masks had ruled the streets of Venice, symbols of liberty, subversion, and sensuality. But all empires fade, and by the late 18th century, the Republic of Venice was teetering. The masks that once dazzled Europe now faced their most powerful enemy yet, Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1797, after over a millennium of independence, Venice fell to Napoleon's armies. The French occupation marked not just a political collapse, but a cultural one. The Serenissima, the most serene republic, was dissolved. Its symbols, ceremonies, and secrets were dismantled with military precision, and one of the first casualties was the carnival. Napoleon and his successors saw carnival as a threat. To them, masks were tools of rebellion, disorder, and vice, dangerous in a city already known for political intrigue. What the Venetians saw as play, the occupiers saw as peril. So they banned carnival entirely. Masks, once worn by every class and creed, were suddenly illegal except for official events and theatre. Overnight, the vibrant chaos of Venetian identity gave way to surveillance and silence. The streets, once filled with music, laughter, and cloaked figures, now echoed with boots and bureaucracy. Mask makers, mascherieri, who once formed one of Venice's proudest guilds, were driven into obscurity. Some shifted to producing theatre props. Others simply vanished. It was more than a costume ban. It was the end of a way of life. For centuries, masks had allowed Venetians to critique their leaders, cross social lines, and indulge in a second, secret self. Without them, Venice felt exposed, constrained, its theatrical soul stripped bare. The 19th century brought more foreign rulers, Austrians, then Italians, and with them more restrictions. Carnival became a ghost, celebrated quietly in back rooms or preserved only on stage. The grand masked balls, once attended by kings and composers, disappeared. The streets that once hosted parades and processions grew still. For nearly 2 centuries, the masks of Venice slept, but not forever. By the late 20th century, in a burst of cultural revival and tourism, the Carnival of Venice was reborn, a nod to the past, reinvented for the modern world. The masks returned, not as weapons of rebellion, but as art, elegant, theatrical, and a little bit nostalgic, because even when outlawed, the mask never truly disappeared. It simply waited, quietly, behind the curtain. By the late 20th century, the silence that had settled over Venice for nearly 200 years began to crack, not with rebellion, but with revival. In 1979, the city officially reinstated the Carnival of Venice, and with it came the grand return of the mask. But this time, it wasn't about social upheaval or hidden sin. It was about art, heritage, and, yes, tourism. The reimagined carnival was spectacular. With backing from local cultural organisations and international sponsors, Venice transformed once again into a living theatre. Streets brimmed with costumed figures in elaborate 18th century dress, gliding through the fog like ghosts of the Republic. Gondolas shimmered under fireworks. Piazza San Marco echoed with classical music, acrobats, and masked balls that now catered more to the camera lens than to political anonymity. And the masks, they became art pieces. The old guild of Maschera was reborn. Artisans began handcrafting masks in papier-mâché, ceramic, leather, and even glass, each piece unique, colourful, and symbolic. Shops that once quietly sold souvenirs now proudly displayed masks in their windows like jewellery. The designs, once functional, were now flamboyant. Glittering feathers, painted gold leaf, jewelled brows, and swirling filigree. Modern favourites include the dramatic volto, a full-faced mask reminiscent of the bauta, but often more ornate. The ever-popular colombina, a half-mask worn by women, often feathered or gilded. And fantasy creations that borrow from animals, mythology, or surrealism. The Commedia dell'arte characters also returned. Harlequin, Pantalone, and Il Dottore now paraded for photos, not satire. Of course, something was different. The carnival of the 1980s and beyond was not the dangerous, unpredictable masquerade of the old Republic. The new carnival was safe, curated, and monetized. It was a festival of memory, a reenactment rather than a ritual. Foreign visitors far outnumbered Venetians. Costumes were rented, events ticketed, and the once secretive masks now posted proudly on Instagram. Still, the magic persisted. For a few weeks each year, Venice remembered how to be someone else, how to walk in silence beneath a mask, to see without being seen. Even in the age of smartphones and street vendors, that old Venetian spell, mystery wrapped in elegance, still worked. The carnival didn't come back the same, but like Venice itself, it adapted, endured, and shimmered once more. Why did the people of Venice, for centuries, choose to hide behind masks? What made a culture so devoted to appearances also fall so deeply in love with anonymity? At its core, the Venetian mask is about something profoundly human, the desire to escape one's assigned identity. In a world ruled by birth, class, gender, and obligation, the mask was liberation. Behind it, a merchant could become a rogue. A nun could flirt. A noble could confess weakness. A man could become a woman. A woman could become myth. The mask didn't erase your face. It gave you a new one. In this way, masks weren't just fabric and plaster. They were psychological devices, letting people explore hidden selves, express forbidden desires, and challenge oppressive norms. They blurred the line between actor and audience, between performance and personhood. And in Venice, a city built on water, illusion, and shifting reflections, that kind of transformation made perfect sense. Even today, the magic of the mask lingers. Whether in carnival or cosplay, Halloween or masquerade balls, the act of hiding the face still holds power. We slip into new roles. We say things we wouldn't otherwise say. We feel braver, freer, bolder. There's a strange honesty in disguise, the kind that tells the truth not by revealing, but by concealing. The Venetian mask is also a symbol of paradox. It represents both democracy and hierarchy, anonymity and attention, rebellion and tradition. It is both seductive and unsettling. It liberates, but it can also be used to deceive. In Venice, It allowed the oppressed to mock the powerful, and the powerful to commit sins without consequence. It was both shield and sword. As the world today becomes ever more watched, tracked, and exposed, the mask reminds us of something we're losing: the right to privacy, the right to mystery, the right to reinvent ourselves without explanation. In Venice, they wore masks not to hide who they were, but to explore who they could be. So next time you see a Venetian mask, glimmering with gold, feathers fluttering in the wind, remember, it's not just a souvenir, it's a key to a city of shadows, to a festival of freedom, to the ever-changing face of human desire. The Kyoto of the early 1860s was no longer a city of serene temples and poetic calm. It had become a battlefield in disguise. Beneath the surface of its wooden eaves and sacred shrines, political violence simmered. Assassins roamed freely, bodies turned up in rivers, and every street corner echoed with whispers of revolution. The root of the chaos was simple: Japan was splitting in two. After more than 2 centuries of peace under the Tokugawa shogunate, foreign powers, especially America, Britain, and France, had forced open Japan's borders. Gunboats had shattered the illusion of isolation. In response, nationalist movements began rallying around a central idea: Sono Joy, meaning revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. But these weren't just slogans, they were battle cries. Pro-imperial samurai from domains like Choshu and Satsuma began infiltrating Kyoto, seeing the city as the symbolic heart of Japan. Their goal? Undermine the shogunate's grip and reassert imperial power. Every skirmish, every assassination, was a small symbolic strike at the status quo. The shogunate, based in Edo, modern-day Tokyo, watched helplessly as its influence unraveled in Kyoto. They still held legal power, but their authority was being mocked in the capital. To respond, the shogunate sent a group of warriors known as the Roshigumi, a temporary militia of masterless samurai, or ronin, to act as an escort for the shogun during his visit to Kyoto in 1863. But something unexpected happened. When the mission ended, a splinter group of 13 ronin refused to leave. They saw Kyoto not just as a duty, but as a calling. These men would form the nucleus of what would become the Shinsengumi. Backed by the Aizu domain, a powerful ally of the shogunate, these men were tasked with patrolling Kyoto and rooting out anti-shogunate agitators. Unlike regular samurai, they weren't nobles or hereditary warriors. Many came from humble or even disgraced backgrounds. But they had one thing in common: absolute loyalty to the shogunate and an appetite for blood if needed. Kyoto, once the quiet capital of emperors, was now a city under siege from within, and out of this smoke and paranoia, a new force emerged, wearing blue jackets, wielding swords, and enforcing order with chilling resolve. The Shinsengumi had arrived. The Shinsengumi began as little more than a ragtag band of ronin with a mission. But within a few short years, they evolved into one of the most feared forces in Kyoto, a sword-wielding police corps draped in blue haori and soaked in the blood of rebels. At the core of this transformation were 3 key leaders: Serizawa Kamo, Kondo Isami, and Hijikata Toshizo. All were ambitious, disciplined, and came from non-samurai backgrounds, an insult in the eyes of traditional feudal Japan. But what they lacked in pedigree, they made up for with ferocity and conviction. Serizawa, one of the original co-founders, was violent, unpredictable, and ultimately self-destructive. His reckless behavior, drunken brawls, extortion, and even attacking innocent civilians, put the fledgling group's legitimacy at risk. Kondo, a former instructor at the Tenin Rishin-Ryu dojo, and Hijikata, his icy, fanatically loyal lieutenant, saw the danger. So in 1863, they arranged a purge. Serizawa and his loyalists were assassinated in a night raid by their own comrades. It was brutal, efficient, and set the tone for what the Shinsengumi would become: loyal to the shogunate, loyal to each other, and absolutely ruthless toward internal dissent. Under Kondo's command and Hijikata's iron discipline, the Shinsengumi adopted a strict code of conduct. Members were forbidden from deserting, disobeying orders, or engaging in private duels. The penalty? Seppuku, ritual suicide. If you joined the Shinsengumi, you gave them everything: your sword, your life, your name. Their distinctive uniform, a light blue haori jacket often marked with white stripes, made them instantly recognizable. It was both a badge of honor and a psychological weapon. When Kyoto citizens saw those jackets in the mist, they knew violence was close. But this wasn't just about brute strength. The Shinsengumi saw themselves as samurai idealists, the last vanguard of a fading era. In a time when many warriors were abandoning the sword for politics or firearms, they clung to Bushido, loyalty, discipline, and martial excellence. They didn't want to modernize, they wanted to purify, and so the streets of Kyoto trembled. Assassins were hunted, conspirators were interrogated or executed. The Shinsengumi weren't just enforcing order, they were reshaping it, one sword stroke at a time. If there was a moment that catapulted the Shinsengumi from obscure street enforcers to legendary defenders of the shogunate, it was the Ikadaya incident of 1864. On a humid summer night in July, amid the paper lanterns and wooden corridors of central Kyoto, the Shinsengumi changed the fate of Japan's twilight era. With swords drawn and reputations carved in blood, rumors had been swirling that the pro-imperial Choshu clan and other anti-shogunate samurai were plotting something big. An arson attack meant to destroy Kyoto and kidnap or assassinate high-ranking officials. The goal? Create chaos, destabilize the shogunate, and rally the country to the emperor's side. The Shinsengumi, operating as both spies and swordsmen, caught wind of the plot and traced it to the Ikadaya Inn, a discreet lodging house near Sanjo Street. Acting on a tip, Kondo Isami led a small squad of just 10 men. Hijikata Toshizo followed shortly with reinforcements. What they walked into was a room full of armed revolutionaries, far outnumbering the Shinsengumi. What followed was less a fight and more a slaughter. In a tight space lit only by oil lamps and the occasional flash of steel, the Shinsengumi launched a ferocious surprise attack. The inn exploded into chaos. Walls splintered, screams pierced the night, and tatami mats ran red. After 2 hours, at least 7 rebels lay dead. Many more were wounded or captured, and the plot to burn Kyoto was thoroughly dismantled. The cost? 1 Shinsengumi member killed, a few injured. But the gain? National fame. The Tokugawa shogunate praised the Shinsengumi for saving Kyoto. Citizens began to see them as necessary guardians. Even their harshest critics admitted one thing: the wolves in blue were terrifyingly effective. But the Ikadaya incident also revealed something deeper, that the Shinsengumi were not just defenders of law, but assassins with legal protection. Their power grew, their fear factor intensified, and their enemies multiplied. To the pro-imperial samurai, the Shinsengumi were no longer mere obstacles. They were monsters, tools of an outdated regime, slaughtering their own countrymen for a crumbling shogunate. But for Kondo and Hijikata, that night was proof of purpose. They had drawn their swords for order, and they wouldn't sheathe them again until either the shogunate stood firm, or they fell with it. The Shinsengumi's rise after the Ikadaya incident wasn't just due to brute force. It was the result of a well-oiled culture of discipline, martial precision, and ruthless psychological warfare. Kyoto had no shortage of armed men, but the Shinsengumi made themselves terrifyingly distinct. Their training regimen was legendary. Recruits drilled daily in the Tenon Rishin-ryu, the sword school of Commander Kondo Isami. This was a style built not for elegant duels, but for lethal combat in tight quarters. Alleys, inn-rooms, crowded temples. The kind of swordsmanship that worked in real Kyoto streets, not on polished dojo floors. And they didn't just fight with steel. Surveillance and intelligence were key parts of their strategy. The Shinsengumi maintained a tight network of informants, many of them disguised as commoners, monks, or merchants. They shadowed suspects, intercepted messages, and eavesdropped on rebels' whispers. When they struck, they already knew everything: names, hideouts, allies. But fear was their real weapon. Kyoto residents learned to dread the midnight knock, a sudden raid, a flurry of sandals on wood, and the unmistakable flash of light blue hari as men were dragged away, often never to be seen again. The Shinsengumi carried a reputation for zero tolerance. One rebellious whisper could get you interrogated, beaten, or executed on the spot. Even among themselves, disobedience meant seppuku. Hijikata Toshizo, nicknamed the Demon Vice Commander, enforced this culture with chilling resolve. Cold, calculating, and fiercely loyal to the Tokugawa cause, he created a corps that demanded more than obedience. It demanded identity. Members were no longer individuals. They were Shinsengumi first, men second. Their ranks swelled. From 13 original Ronin, the corps grew to nearly 200 at its peak. But this expansion came at a price. Not all recruits shared the original members' fanaticism. Some were spies. Others cracked under the pressure. Internal purges became common. Brothers turned against brothers. Yet in the midst of all this, the Shinsengumi still held one absolute belief: that Japan's feudal order was worth defending. They weren't fighting for a paycheck. They were fighting for an ideal, the samurai world, where loyalty trumped politics and the sword defined truth. But ideals, no matter how sharp, can break. And the world around them was beginning to change, faster than any katana could strike. As the 1860s marched on, the ground beneath the Shinsengumi began to shift. The Tokugawa shogunate, the very institution they had sworn their lives to protect, was losing its grip on Japan. Foreign pressure, internal dissent, and economic turmoil had cracked its foundations. What had once been a question of loyalty was fast becoming a question of survival. Outside Kyoto, powerful domains like Satsuma and Choshu were uniting behind the emperor. Once rivals, these clans now shared a common enemy, the Tokugawa regime. And while the Shinsengumi were busy hunting rebels in alleyways, these domains were modernizing their armies, importing rifles, training with Western officers, and preparing for war. The age of the sword was being eclipsed by the age of the bullet. Inside the city, public opinion was also shifting. The Shinsengumi's once heroic image had begun to sour. Their strict methods, once seen as necessary, were now viewed as brutality. Their patrols were feared, not respected. And when they killed, it no longer felt like justice. It felt like desperation. In 1867, the blow finally came. Tokugawa Yoshinobu, the last shogun, announced his resignation and handed power back to the emperor. At first, this seemed like a peaceful transition, but it was a tactical move, an attempt to preserve Tokugawa influence under a new imperial banner. The pro-imperial forces saw through it immediately. Kyoto now belonged to the emperor. The capital had changed sides. The Shinsengumi, however, refused to stand down. To them, Yoshinobu's resignation was a betrayal, but not the end. They relocated to Fushimi, a village south of Kyoto, and began preparing for battle. The pro-imperial army was moving fast, modern weapons in hand, and the Shinsengumi, still armed mostly with swords, were dangerously behind. They called it the Boshin War, a civil war between the old Tokugawa order and the new imperial forces. The Shinsengumi would become one of the last true samurai battalions to fight in it. The world around them was changing at gunpoint, but they wouldn't abandon their code, they wouldn't modernize, and they certainly wouldn't remove their blue jackets. Instead, they sharpened their blades and marched toward history's final battlefield. In January 1868, as snow fell over the outskirts of Kyoto, the Shinsengumi faced their most formidable challenge, the Battle of Toba-Fushimi, a clash that would ignite the Boshin War and mark the beginning of the end for the samurai order. The Shinsengumi, still loyal to the Tokugawa shogunate, took up arms alongside a small contingent of Tokugawa forces. Their enemy, a coalition of Satsuma, Choshu and Tosa domain warriors armed not just with swords, but modern rifles, artillery and Western training. The Shinsengumi, dressed in their signature blue haori and carrying katanas and outdated firearms, looked like ghosts from a bygone age. Romantic, proud, but tragically outmatched. Commanding the Shinsengumi was Kondo Isami, though he was no longer the swift swordsman of Ikedaya fame. Age, injury and responsibility had slowed him. His trusted lieutenant, Hijikata Toshizo, remained as fierce as ever, but even he couldn't ignore the imbalance in firepower. The clash began with volleys of gunfire and cannon blasts, technology that rendered swordsmanship nearly useless. Despite this, the Shinsengumi charged with classic samurai courage. They cut down enemy riflemen in close quarters. They defended their lines with discipline and defiance. But it wasn't enough. The imperial forces flew a golden banner representing the emperor, and many Tokugawa troops, demoralized and confused, refused to fire on it. Some surrendered. Others fled. The Shinsengumi did neither. They fought until their lines were broken, then retreated in a haze of blood and smoke. Casualties were heavy. Spirits were shattered. The days of tight street raids in Kyoto were gone. This was war on a new scale, a modern war, and the Shinsengumi were already relics. The defeat at Toba Fushimi was more than a military loss. It was a symbolic death knell for the old Japan. The imperial court officially declared the Tokugawa as enemies of the throne. Suddenly the samurai protectors of Kyoto had become outlaws. But even as their world collapsed, the Shinsengumi refused to disband. They fled south, regrouped, and made one final vow. They would continue fighting, not for victory, but for honor. If they couldn't win the war, they would at least die as warriors. The last wolves of the shogunate were not ready to vanish, not yet. After the crushing defeat at Toba Fushimi, the Shinsengumi were no longer defenders of Kyoto. They were fugitives. Their beloved city, once patrolled with sword in hand and law on their lips, now belonged to the emperor. The blue jackets that once commanded fear now marked them for death. But retreat did not mean surrender. Led by the unyielding Hijikata Toshizo, the remaining Shinsengumi regrouped and joined the Tokugawa remnants fleeing north. Kondo Isami, wounded and demoralized, still clung to leadership, though the toll of war had worn him thin. Together, they reorganized under the Koyo Chinbutai, a rebranded unit meant to bring calm to the east. Though in truth, they were chasing a ghost of power that no longer existed. They moved from province to province, chased by imperial forces and haunted by the knowledge that their world was ending. As more Tokugawa loyalists surrendered or defected, the Shinsengumi hardened. They would not trade their swords for pardons. They would not kneel. In April 1868, while attempting to join with allies in Edo, Kondo was captured by imperial forces. Despite using an alias, his identity was uncovered. The punishment was swift: execution by beheading. His head was displayed publicly in Kyoto, a grim warning to any who still clung to the old ways. His death was a devastating blow. Kondo had been the Shinsengumi's father figure, the face of loyalty. But Hijikata did not weep. He sharpened his blade and kept moving north. As the imperial army pushed further, Hijikata and his dwindling band joined the last Tokugawa resistance, the Republic of Eizo, a short-lived breakaway government established in Hokkaido by loyalist remnants. There, the Shinsengumi hoped to make a final stand. It was a bleak, wind-swept place at the edge of the world, but it was still Japan, and they would defend it as long as breath remained. Their numbers were small, their supplies were thin, but Hijikata's will was iron. Even in defeat, he believed their sacrifice would be remembered, not as rebellion, but as fidelity to a dying code. They were no longer a police force, no longer protectors of Kyoto. Now they were ghosts, wandering northward through snow and sorrow, chasing an honor that had already begun to vanish with the cherry blossoms. By 1869, the Shinsengumi had followed the crumbling Tokugawa dream as far north as they could go, Hokkaido, then still called Ezo. This frozen frontier, wild and underdeveloped, became the final refuge for the shogunate's last loyalists. There, a desperate attempt was made to preserve their vision of Japan in the form of the Republic of Ezo, the first and only republic in Japanese history, led by the ex-naval officer Enomoto Takeyaki. Hijikata Toshizo, now the de facto leader of the Shinsengumi, served as vice-commander of the defense forces. He was no longer the shadowy enforcer of Kyoto's alleys. He was a general, organizing troops, strategizing defense lines, and preparing for what he surely knew was a doomed last stand. By now, the Shinsengumi were but a fragment of their former selves, fewer than 100 men, exhausted and scarred. Yet Hijikata's presence kept them alive. He rode in uniform, sword at his side, leading from the front. It wasn't victory he sought anymore. It was a death worthy of remembrance. The Imperial Army, modernized and well-equipped, launched a full assault on Hokkaido. They captured stronghold after stronghold, pushing the last samurai forces toward Hakodate, the final bastion. There, amid cannon fire and the cold northern sea, Hijikata made his stand. On June 20th, 1869, during a skirmish near the fort of Ippongi, Hijikata was struck by enemy fire, a bullet to the lower back. He was 34 years old. The demon vice-commander, who had survived purges, civil war and revolution, died not in a blaze of sword-to-sword glory, but by gunshot, a fitting end for a man out of time. His body was never recovered. Some say it was buried secretly by loyal comrades. Others believe he was cremated to avoid desecration. But his final letter, written shortly before the battle, contained no bitterness, only pride, and a single request, that his legacy be remembered. With Hijikata's death, the Shinsengumi effectively ceased to exist. The Republic of Ezo surrendered days later, marking the complete collapse of the Tokugawa loyalist resistance. The Meiji government had won. The samurai age was over. But in the snow and silence of Hakodate, the ghost of Hijikata remained. He had lost the war, but kept his code, and in doing so, he became immortal. Though the Shinsengumi were ultimately defeated and disbanded, their legacy lived on far beyond the battlefield. In the rapidly modernizing Japan of the Meiji era, the world they had fought to preserve was vanishing, yet the Shinsengumi's story became a powerful symbol of loyalty, sacrifice, and the samurai spirit. During the Meiji Restoration, Japan abandoned feudalism, embraced Western technology, and rewrote its social order. The samurai class was abolished, swords were banned, and a new national army arose. To many, the Shinsengumi represented a bygone age, fierce, inflexible, and tragically outmatched by progress. But their story resonated deeply, especially in literature, theatre, and later film. Writers portrayed them as tragic heroes, men who knew the world was changing, but chose to fight anyway, loyal to a fading ideal. Their strict code of conduct, willingness to sacrifice everything, and intense brotherhood captured imaginations. Among the most celebrated figures were Hijikata Toshizo, the demon vice-commander, whose iron will defined the group's character; Kondo Isami, the honorable leader executed with dignity; and Okita Soji, the youthful sword prodigy whose skill became legendary despite his illness. Today, the Shinsengumi have become a cultural icon in Japan and beyond. Their blue haori, distinctive swords, and stories of fierce loyalty appear in manga, anime, and movies. Historical reenactments and museums in Kyoto and Tokyo celebrate their memory, drawing visitors fascinated by their dramatic history. More than nostalgia, the Shinsengumi's legacy is a reminder of the tension between tradition and change. They stood at the crossroads of history, caught between samurai swords and rifle barrels, feudal codes and modern laws. Their fight was not just political, it was deeply personal, embodying a struggle many cultures face when confronted with unstoppable progress. In the end, the Shinsengumi were not just samurai police. They were men who chose honor over safety, loyalty over convenience, and action over despair. In a world hurtling toward the future, they became symbols of a fading past and the eternal human desire to stand firm even as everything falls away.